I'm here to discuss different subgenres of the fantasy genre. Fantasy obviously means not realistic, but there are different categories of fantasy. So, with my book Great Divide and its sequel Great Desolation, it is considered dark fantasy. Now, dark fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy that has horror elements to it. It's more supernatural, a little scarier than normal fantasy, dark, hence dark fantasy. There is also the subgenre of urban fantasy, which this is also. Urban fantasy is where it has paranormal or supernatural or fantasy elements, but in our world, versus high fantasy that is like a whole other universe built with different characters and races and magic and different languages. So think Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is high fantasy. So this is more dark fantasy and it is more urban fantasy. There's also low fantasy, which this could also possibly go under because it doesn't have as many fantasy elements as stuff like Lord of the Rings. A lot of times when I tell people that my books are dark fantasy, they don't really know what that means because they don't hear that term a lot. But I have to tell them that this is dark fantasy because this is not going to have things in it like fairies and dragons and bat boys and there is some magic-ish to it, but high fantasy is more what people think of when they think of fantasy. But dark fantasy would be more like Constantine or the show Supernatural. Full disclosure, I've never seen Supernatural, but I've been told many times that this and Great Desolation are very similar to Supernatural. Those are also aspects of fantasy that are not normal, typical fantasy that people think of when they think of fantasy. A lot of people automatically assume that fantasy is just like knights and dragons and fairies and stuff like that. But there are different subgenres of fantasy. There's romantasy, which is its own subgenre, where it relies very heavily on the romance story and not so much the fantasy. Now, this does have romance in it. Do not be confused with smut. But the main focus on this is the adventure and the supernatural element and the more fantasy element. There's also historical fantasy. The only thing that I can think of off the top of my head is Hellboy, because there are schmazzies in it, but then also like a demon baby. So that is fantasy, but it's also historical. So when you look at fantasy books, know that they are not going to be across the board the same type of fantasy. So now you know what dark fantasy is.